Greetings, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the NeuroWellness Project, a podcast devoted to exploring compassionate and evidence-informed treatments for autism that may fall outside of the conventional model. And speaking of the conventional model, today we're going to be discussing alternatives to ABA, which is considered the gold standard for autism therapy. ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, is a therapy model that takes skills and breaks them down into structured steps, and then someone is trained in how to complete those steps and acquire new skills. And the goal is to promote social and language and communication skills in autistic individuals by encouraging specific behaviors and discouraging behaviors that are considered undesirable. And while many families and practitioners do report successes using an ABA approach, ABA is coming under an increasing level of scrutiny. There is a growing body of research and personal testimony, especially from autistic adults, who are saying that there are some serious long-term emotional and psychological implications of using an ABA approach. Some studies are linking early exposure to ABA with post-traumatic stress symptoms, saying that ABA encourages masking, emotional suppression, and even violates the sense of self-autonomy. Because especially when ABA is being rigidly applied, it tends to prioritize compliance over connection and performance over well-being. And while ABA is not the only approved or evidence-based approach to autism, it is by far the most dominant and heavily funded model that is used in mainstream care, especially in public schools and insurance-driven systems. And I, of course, have my own experiences and opinions on ABA. When my son was first diagnosed with autism in 2020 at age 2, he entered the New Jersey Early Intervention Program, which is a state program for children with disabilities up to age 3, and they use ABA as like their core foundational strategy. And while I went into the experience very enthusiastic and excited to help my child, it really left me with a deep sense of discomfort. Many of the techniques that they were using just felt dehumanizing to me. Like we were trying to force his behavior to appear neurotypical, even though he clearly is not neurotypical, and that we were kind of training him to perform rather than supporting him in who he really is. And it just didn't sit right with me, because I feel like when somebody is already navigating a complex neurological condition, putting that kind of stress or pressure on them to mask, to comply, to perform may have some negative and even unintended consequences. So when we moved out here 4 years ago, I pulled my son out of public school. He was in pre-K to begin homeschooling, and I started looking around our new community for more affirming, respectful options for speech therapy services for him, and that is when I found today's guest, Amy Pinder, and I am so glad that we did. Amy is the founder of Circles of Communication, which is a neurodiversity-affirming speech therapy center that she runs from her homestead in Stockton, New Jersey. Amy is a licensed ASHA certified speech-language pathologist with over 15 years of experience. She is certified in floor time and trained in modalities like natural language acquisition, prompt, RPM, AAC, reflex integration, trauma-informed care, and more. She is also the co-founder of the Inclusion Festival, which is the country's first sensory-friendly music festival and wellness event, and she is the executive director of Accessible Festivals, which is a nonprofit that aims to make recreation more inclusive for people of all abilities. And I can tell you that Amy's approach is deeply friendly, compassionate, and holistic. She weaves together different approaches to create therapy spaces that are empowering, safe, and most importantly, playful. I am so excited to share this conversation with all of you, not just as the host of this podcast, but as a parent who has been there in questioning whether or not an ABA approach is right for their child. So let's dive right in. Hi, Amy. So excited to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
So I've kind of given a synopsis of your credentials so far, but would you care to give us any backstory about how you got here?
Well, I've kind of always just felt like I was put on this planet in this lifetime to serve and try to kind of spend my life figuring out the neurodivergent population. I didn't have the vocabulary as a child that I have now to explain it all, but I was always just really interested in people whose brains worked differently. I gravitated towards stories about humans who were different, and in real life found myself gravitating towards humans who operated differently. And over time that's come to, kind of be a lens to help me better understand myself. I also identify as neurodivergent, and have learned a lot about myself through working with others.
Beautiful. So, can you maybe talk us through what an inclusive or a neurodiversity affirming therapy looks like in practice and how that maybe differs from a more traditional ABA framework?
Yeah, absolutely. To be neurodiversity affirming is to meet people exactly where they are and to embrace them for who they are without trying to fundamentally change what makes them tick and what makes them operate. So rather than teaching them to fit into the conventions of society, which actually don't serve us all as well as they could, we look at what is going to help that person become the best version of themselves, the best communicator, the best self-advocate, the best problem solver.
Beautiful. And how do you protect a child's autonomy while still making progress towards their goals?
We include them in every step of the process, even at a very, very young age. And so for a very young child, that might look like selecting their activities and not requiring that they do anything specific during a therapy session. I think it's also important to remember that in a neurodiversity affirming model, the therapy itself is the container. So just being in relationship with someone and getting to know someone in a new space is also therapeutic. Like I said, from denying or, choosing to embrace activities that are presented, from showing and selecting their own activities, and then later from playing a role in really discussing and thinking about what goals they want to work towards in therapy.
Definitely. And so I guess it's safe to say that your practice kind of centers more on like a mind-body connection rather than just pushing for like verbal speech. So why do you think it's important to like center on that?
Well, my favorite saying in the universe is that you have to be regulated in order to communicate. And it's so true. I like to liken that to us across the lifespan. As we age, we really can't express ourselves when we're feeling really mad. And that often comes out in our most interpersonal relationships. We really have to be grounded and centered and self-aware. And that fluctuates for all of us across the lifespan, but also moment to moment. So to be able to develop and strengthen a sense of self-awareness and then to develop co-regulation and then self-regulation strategies is imperative to being able to really intentionally communicate in any situation.
Yes. Let's touch on this for a moment. Could you maybe explain to us what the difference between nonverbal and non-speaking is?
Yeah, well, we only use the term non-speaking in our practice, and that's kind of like in the neurodiversity affirming world. That's the correct way to think about it. And the reason is that non-speaking people have verbs, they have words, they have a lot to say, they have thoughts and inner lives that are very, very rich, but are not able to communicate them via speaking. So in my practice, and any neurodiversity affirming therapist will honor all modes of communication, whether that is spoken word or typed word or written word or gestures and body language, facial expressions. I mean, you name it. There's nothing off limits for really assessing and getting to know what a person is attempting to communicate through any modality.
For sure. I say that all the time about my son Carson, who is non-speaking, right? I'm like, he communicates very well. Like, so we might not have like verbal communication, but there's other ways that he does get his point across and communicate with us. And I feel like a lot of families might hear the term nonverbal and assume that that means that their child, can't understand or express communication or language. So how do you help maybe parents and caregivers kind of reframe their thought process around what communication like should and does look like, especially in dealing with somebody who is neurodivergent?
I very simply like to encourage all parents to presume competence, to presume full competence in their children's language and thinking abilities, and to understand that like the neurological processes that prevent them from speaking or from expressing themselves in any conventional way um, is not an indicator of what's going on in their minds and what their inner world is like. So all autistic people, regardless of communication style or modality, should be communicated with in a way that presumes full competence. They should be spoken to. Things should be explained to them. They should be included in decision-making processes and just spoken to like you would any other human.
I'm almost like tearing up here because I have to tell you, you came to my house a few years ago to do a homeschool consult with us.
Yes.
And yeah, Amy came over just to kind of like assess, our setup and kind of what we had going on. I think Carson was 5 at the time, and I also had his younger brother who was 3. And I remember asking you, like, I have, Jacob who sits down at the table and looks at the board and, is able to, speak back and forth. And I was like, how do I know if Carson is, hearing me? And you just said exactly what you just said and kind of reassured me, like, he hears you, like he is fully confident. And yeah, I just have to tell you, like, what an impactful like reframe that was for me as a parent, not just as like somebody trying to homeschool, but just as a parent in general. And I think that's a misconception that we might have a lot of the time, is that even if somebody is, like not looking at us or, isn't speaking back, that maybe they're like not understanding or don't have the ability to understand what we're saying. But I think I did want to touch on apraxia here. When my
Yeah.
son was first diagnosed with autism, he got, the ASD diagnosis and also mixed expressive receptive language disorder, which we found out later on was apraxia. So would you care to maybe give us like a quick definition of what apraxia is and maybe how common you think that it might be in the neurodivergent non-speaking community?
I think it's really common in that community, and I like to explain it as just the brain is wired differently, and there's a disconnect between the literal neuronal connections between the brain and the oral motor mechanisms in the mouth. So that makes spoken language really hard for some who get a diagnosis of autism, and it doesn't have anything to do with the language centers and the language, like the language thought processing and formation. It's really just the motor modality. So there's a difference in the pathways that lead to the motor act of speech. So language and speech are two very, very different things. And what we're finding more and more among the autism population is that there's just general dyspraxia that comes in many, many forms. So for some people, it's the speech, and for some people, it's whole body movements, or it's all of it, or it's just a piece of it. So there's some people that are able to speak but have really trouble, like have a lot of trouble with fine motor acts, or have trouble understanding where their body is in space. And it's all related to dyspraxia. It's all related to, like, on a neurological sense, how the brain is wired and how those messages are sent and fired. But yeah, thinking in languages, we can always assume that it's intact. And I wanted to kind of go back to what you're saying about, I'm thinking about Carson wandering around and about so many kids who would prefer to be wandering around in a social or educational setting, but who, we as a society have kind of come to this default that you have to be sitting and you have to be oriented and making eye contact in order to be listening and learning. And that's just not true. And that in itself is an example of why society itself can be very non-inclusive, because there's so many ways to digest and process information, and most of us would probably benefit from some kind of motion while we're absorbing information.
For sure. Thank you for that. Are there any other like common misconceptions that parents, caregivers, or even educators and other therapists might have about autistic individuals?
I think needing to really rotely teach language is a misconception. Like when you
Mm,
come across a kid who doesn't speak to communicate, you think that like they don't have intact language, and they often do, because we learn language just by being in the environment and being immersed in it. We don't have to discreetly teach language to most kids. I think that in itself also can get confused when it comes to higher level learning. Like I think that some older autistic children end up being excluded from English language arts curriculums that help them to advance their language skills, assuming that they don't have the prerequisite, the basic foundations of language. And so they end up getting like stuck and being taught like very basic things that their brain already knows how to do without being taught, things like creative writing and things like grammar rules and things that require, more direct instruction. So it's really important to just presume that kids with autism are probably absorbing language at about the same pace as their speaking peers. And educate them, give them access to general curriculum and assume that they're doing something productive with that and that it's going to show up. I'm a relatively new mom. I have a 1.5-year-old, and he just is what he is. But I see it in him, and it reminds me about how all brains work, and that he digests things and they come back later. Like he might sit through a library story time and not do anything but just look, and then come home
hmm
and say everything that was said, 2 days later.
Oh, yeah. I guess my next question would be, have you ever had moments with clients that kind of like show this to you, that kind of like change the way that people might think about communication?
Yeah, a zillion times. Yeah, I think that, some of my earliest experiences are just connecting with clients and noticing how deeply so many autistic clients have connected with people that they perceive really believe in them, and who treat them as if they're competent and deserving, worthy humans. And that was probably the first and is the most lasting thing that always sticks with me, is the relationships I've been able to build with my clients and how those don't seem to go away in time. Like if I
Mhm.
haven't seen a client in years, but then see them again, like there's still like a specialness there, a closeness there. And I think that just speaks to them craving that someone sees them for what they're really experiencing, and going back, presumes that competence in them.
Definitely. What would you like families to know maybe about the natural communication skills about autistic individuals other than just presuming competence? Like, what are some other ways that they might be trying to communicate that we might not be picking up on if we're not presuming competence?
That makes me think of the natural language acquisition model that you referenced when you read my bio.
Hmm
So there's two different types of language processors. There's analytic language processors and there's gestalt language processors. And
Mm,
analytic language processors tend to learn language in single word pieces bit by bit, and then learn, gradually, just by modeling and being immersed in language, to put together more and more complex sentences. So that's why, and that's how it's been presumed that most people learn that way. So that's why when you go to the pediatrician, the developmental checklist is like combines 2 words, combines 3 words, and it goes on
hmm
and on and up from there. But
hmm
for some kids, and it's very common for kids on the spectrum to be a gestalt language processor, which means they tend to memorize whole chunks of language. Um, and then their brain has to break it apart in order to be able to successfully recombine it. So if there's an extra step in the process because they have to break it down to build it back up. But it's a valid way of communicating and learning to communicate. It's not in itself a disorder. It's just a different way of learning. And again, I mean, I don't know yet what my son is going to be like as he grows up. I don't, like I said, I feel like I identify as neurodivergent, and I'm
hmm
not sure that we aren't all somewhere on the spectrum of neurodivergence. But in any
Yeah.
case, he seems to also benefit from learning whole chunks of language, and I see him breaking them down and manipulating them. So it's really made me pause and wonder if we all don't learn a little bit this way, and if there's something about, someone that just said that we all learn the other way, the analytic way, and then we all kind of got stuck in that, and now we're not accommodating all of the different learning styles. But all of this is to say that if you've got an autistic kid who's repeating whole chunks of language, who's scripting, who is diagnosed with, what they call echolalia, like that's not an invalid way to communicate. You shouldn't stop it or try to change it. It's actually a really useful part of their learning process. And it's communicative as well often. So there might be messages there that they're trying to communicate by using a whole chunk. This is a whole topic into itself, but there's a lot there that you can learn about what your kid is saying if they're using an entire phrase in or out of context, and what that might mean, and how to support that type of language development, which again is super valid.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. What are your views on like alternative communication methods like AAC and spelling to communicate? Like, when do you think that a family should start incorporating that with their therapist into their child's treatment plan?
It's really never too early. When it comes to alternative forms of communication that require tech modalities, like augmentative and alternative communication systems, the most popular ones out there being Proloquo or Touch Chat, it really requires a dedicated communication partner to model that language. Like I said, we learn language by being immersed in it. So to introduce an AAC system and determine whether or not it's going to be functional for an individual isn't possible unless they are immersed in the use of that system with a dedicated partner or partners, ideally, for a lengthy period of time. So it's a great approach for someone who's non-speaking, as is learning how to write or to type, depending on their skill set. Somewhere, down the line, this idea of typing to communicate being like its own modality became a thing when the rapid prompting method and spelling to communicate emerged and took off. And, somehow that became controversial. But I've never been able to wrap my brain around how we could possibly deny a non-speaking person the ability to learn how to type to communicate, because these AAC systems don't allow limitless communication. Yes. I love to just have a parent or a caregiver or a teacher or an aide or whoever I'm providing support to try to tell me anything about themselves with a device like Proloquo to go. It's very difficult, sometimes impossible, to communicate the thought that you intend. So typing is really the answer. That's communication freedom for a person that is not able to develop motor speech skills. So I'm all for them. In either case, it takes a dedicated communication and regulation partner to achieve that, because there's fine motor involved there too, especially if we're talking about an individual who is also dyspraxic or apraxic.
Yes, exactly. And I think that a lot of families, when they are trying to navigate an IEP or even like advocating for speech services for their child, it can be tough out here. It can be a little bit rough. Do you have any advice for those families out there that are kind of looking for the type of support that a practice like yours is able to offer?
Yeah, I've done a lot of that work with families. I think when navigating the school systems, in particular, you mentioned IEPs. I think the goals aren't as important as, like what I just said, as ensuring the child has a communication regulation partner at school, or maybe multiple, who's modeling functional modalities for them again and again and again, and honoring all of their communication, celebrating their communication, repeating back to them what they said to try to help them like hear it, make sense of it. There's some other strategies that I recommend, but I mean, that's really the nitty gritty of it, is just honoring all communication and modeling communication without a lot of expectation. So, it's when parents come with like, do these goals look okay? And it's things like answering WH questions and following multiple step directions and, creating action agent object sentences. I don't think any of that matters so much, these measurable goals that schools really rely on, as much as just having an invested, validating communication model and partner.
That's
so
beautiful.
It's yeah, and there's ways to kind of bridge that gap and those gaps in understanding, and kind of pare down IEP goals and make some requests that, can be measurable, because that is how school districts operate. But like, that's,
Is that something that you're open to providing for people, like navigating the IEPs and advice or
yeah,
consulting like that?
yeah, I
Okay.
do. I do quite a bit of that, actually. Yeah.
Cool. So your approach, this compassionate, this affirming, this holistic approach to speech for autistic individuals, how do you think that this approach kind of ripples outward to create more inclusive communities, not just in, the hour a week or whatever, this child gets like in their speech therapy room every week, but kind of like in daily life? I know this probably ties into the Inclusion Festival and your work with accessible festivals, if you maybe wanted to speak on that for a minute.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the real impact comes from the work with families. Like,
Mm,
kids' families are what matters most, or whoever they're living with, whoever kids' primary influences and caregivers are, those are the most important role models in their lives. So changing the ways that families view them and view their role in guiding them is the most important part of my work. Because that makes the biggest impact, is changing families' perceptions and then family behavior and dynamics. And then, yeah, at a more societal level, I created an inclusion festival, which we strive to just show and honor and celebrate all of the different ways of being and help people see the differences in themselves and just have conversations about that in a way that is relaxed and playful without the pressure of, a work or school setting where you kind of feel like you need to be a certain way. A festival invites us to just come as we are, just for the sake of being, for recreation. And then some really, really interesting conversations and connections can happen in that space. So that's exactly what we set out to do with the creation of that festival. And that work. And that came from like an infusion of my own personal passion and meeting the right people along the way to make
mm.
that dream a reality. Um, and it's been a really cool journey to see, how it's changed people's lives, with just really little things, like surprisingly little moments. Witnessing small things at the festival really changed perspectives for people. And I just know that because people have told me how it's impacted them. And that's what matters, is just those little bits of like aha moments, helping to facilitate aha moments in people that are going to take that home to their communities and behave a little different when they're walking down their streets.
Beautiful. And how can our listeners and our viewers find more information about you and your practice? And are you accepting new clients? I would like to touch on, I think you're offering like virtual classes
Mhm.
and stuff now. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah,
Cool.
we're almost always accepting new clients. Clients come and go, and we're a small team of three now. So yes, we're accepting new clients. We see clients virtually. We see them at my small homestead that you mentioned, and we also have an office in Flemington, New Jersey. Um, And we also offer virtual classes, which are special interest groups, aimed at teens and mostly neurodivergent young adults, just to explore interests and connect with others that have similar interests to them. We have things like Lego Club and anime and crafting and book club, and Disney Chat Club is our most popular.
Ooh.
Um, and we also newly started, like just a support circle, like just for like mental health and wellness. We have things like yoga and mindfulness, types of things. Really a lot of different topics. And that actually all came from the festival world. The way that program grew is we connected with people through the festivals that we run, who, are neurodivergent or neurodivergent thinking, like thinkers, and they are, interested in supporting the whole vision and mission of Inclusion Festival. So we found a way to make that a year-round thing by offering these classes akin to the types of workshops that we'd offer at the festival. And now you can meet weekly, with people from across the state.
Wow. And I guess my last question would be, if you had to say anything to a family who is considering kind of like jumping ship from the conventional model and moving into a more, a private sector speech therapy. Do you have any words of advice for them on navigating the insurance situation? You helped me with this a lot, so if you could just like give us a few words.
I don't know exactly what to say about that. We don't accept insurance because it's just such a difficult world to navigate. But parents can advocate for services. There's things like radius clauses if you can't find a provider within a certain radius that meets your needs. So it's annoying, but it's something that you can advocate for and insist that your child needs this particular type of service, and you can just be the squeaky wheel. And that does seem to work for some of our families. We're always willing to support that process with advice and letters of rationale and explanation. So we'll do anything we can to support families getting reimbursed, and it's a difficult system, but it is worth it. We also offer a sliding scale for both our private and our online therapy sessions because I really want our services to be accessible, and I really want parents to have this information. And I also think like if weekly sessions don't resonate or weekly groups, like just a couple of conversations can be all that a parent needs to really get like just little bits of wisdom and advice and to reframe what they're thinking and what they're feeling stuck with. And I love to do that. So I really welcome just consultative calls. Again, it's parents who are going to make the difference and caregivers. Whoever a child is living with, that they're going to make the biggest difference. So supporting your own mental health as a parent and educating yourself and providing the right words of support, providing yourself with the right words of support from, philosophically aligned professionals. It doesn't have to be weekly therapy that you can, maybe not afford, but just a couple of conversations might make a world of difference for your family. I really believe that.
For sure. Me too. And I do have to say about the insurance, definitely for anybody out there who is considering private speech therapy, it is likely that your insurance, even though they will not cover a service like Amy's practice provides, that they will provide at least a percentage of reimbursement. So what you would have to do would be to, gather up your documents and have them sent over. I know one time I got into quite a debacle with our insurance company, and they needed Amy to send this form over like 3 times, and they kept losing it, and it was a whole thing. So that advice about being the squeaky wheel, and I kept calling back and I kept calling back, and eventually we did get a check for it. And I will tell you, it is possible. But I think that the benefits from pursuing a more affirming approach to speech for an autistic child, the benefits far outweigh the annoyances of having to, fight the money out of the insurance company's pockets. So just a personal note there.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. And I think that about wraps it up. Amy, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you are a very busy woman, new mom, like business owner. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk
Thanks so
with
much
us
for
today.
having me. I love to talk about all of this, and I hope it really helps those who are listening.
I'm sure it will. And thank you all so much for watching. We will see you really soon for our next episode.